If it happens, it will be the most post-apocalyptic war in generations. A conflict so brutal, so devastating, it could eclipse even Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the last few years, the idea of a US-China war has gone from fringe possibility to something both sides openly speculate about. The reasons for this are myriad, ranging from generic stuff like great power competition to incredibly specific issues like China's stance towards Taiwan. The important part is that a terrifying number of people now agree that such a conflict is possible. Yet for all these Cassandras might be proven right, there's one thing no one can say for sure. One thing that will remain a mystery until the moment it happens. How a US-China war actually starts. Now, on the face of it, the answer seems simple. A full-blown invasion of Taiwan is the nightmare that keeps Pentagon planners up at night. But that's not the only scenario in play. From a collision in the South China Sea to a grave miscalculation over the Philippines, there are numerous potential trigger points out there. Trigger points that could soon unleash the biggest war in decades. In 2017, a new book made waves in American national security circles. Written by political scientist Graham T. Allison and titled Destined for War, it sought to place the growing US-China rivalry into deep historical context, to understand how likely it was that conflict would break out between the world's two great powers. The unfortunate answer? It could be very likely. Allison's approach was to step back from debates over Taiwan or trade wars and instead focus on phenomenon he found across history: the Thucydides Trap. Thucydides, you see, was an Athenian general who wrote a history of the devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. When casting around for a trigger for this carnage, he hit upon a brilliantly simple explanation. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. It was this sentence that Allison used to popularize the Thucydides Trap concept, the fear that overtakes an established great power when a new challenger begins to rise, a fear that can ultimately make war all but inevitable. A big shout out to Ridge for sponsoring today's video. Now, what do wallets and high-performance cars have in common? Well, Ridge and Hennessy are teaming up for an epic summer sweepstakes that's about to rev up your star game and your chances of winning big. If you've ever thought about upgrading your wallet game, well, now's the time. Ridge and Hennessy are a match made in pocket heaven. The Ridge wallet does the impossible. Holds up to 12 cards, although I, like a normal person, don't have 12. I got like 3, 2 bank cards, and my driver's license. But I suppose, you could put a library card in there, more bank cards if you're feeling rich. Say goodbye to your old leather dad wallet that's full of receipts and streamline your life in style. But that's not all. Ridge also has the key case, which is fantastic. It's all like Swiss Army knife for keys. You just slide them out here. Very easy to put these in as well, by the way. And then there's no more keys jangling around in your pocket, which is nice. They've got over 30 colors and styles, including carbon fiber, which I don't have here. I do have their burnt titanium, which is very nice. They've also got forged ember, burnt Damascus. You're going to find one to suit your style. And here's a little secret. When you pair the Ridge wallet with the key case, you can get up to 30% off, which is very nice. You've also now got the chance to ride off into the sunset in a brand new Hennessy Ford Bronco Velociraptor, or walk away with a cool $75,000 in cash. It's your choice. And hey, here's the scoop. By entering on their website, you're in the running. No money needed. Plus, for every $1 you spend on the site, you get a bonus entry. Plus, custom Hennessy products, like this fantastic Ridge wallet right here, come with up to 1,000 bonus entries. And also, if you use my link, ridge.com/warographics, you'll snag an extra 10 bonus entries, which is nice. Use the code warographics and you get 10% off at checkout. Brilliant. So up your wallet game. Thank you to Ridge for sponsoring. And now back to today's episode. Along with the Harvard Belfer Center, Allison applied this concept to the last 600 years or so of history. In that span of time, he identified 16 separate moments when a rising power threatened to overtake an established one. In all but 4 cases, they wound up going to war. Now, we don't have time to cover all 16, but just to give you some idea, recent examples include the rise of Prussia in the mid-19th century that led to the Franco-Prussian War, or the rise of Japan in the late 19th century that led to conflicts with both China and Russia. Staying with Japan, it was the empire's continued expansion into the Pacific that led to the United States entering World War II. Meanwhile, the rising Germany led to not only 1, but 2 wars with the European powers of France and Britain. Now, we could go on, but you get the idea. From the Habsburg-Valois wars of the 16th century to the 2 world wars, the arrival of a new power does tend to trigger violence. Today, that new power, the rising Athens, is China, and the USA is old, worried Sparta. This is why so many believe that a Sino-American war is on the horizon, why someone like James Crabtree, Asia Director of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, can warn, quote, "On our current course, some kind of military confrontation between the US and China over the coming decade now looks more likely than not." Still, such a conflict isn't a done deal. While the Harvard Belfer Center only documents 4 instances where the Thucydides Trap failed to spring, 3 of them were in the modern era. First, when America displaced the British Empire as the great global power. Second, when the USSR challenged American supremacy. And third, when a reunified Germany became Europe's new powerhouse in the 1990s. In each case, the established great powers found a way to accommodate the newcomer. The British Empire backed off from the Western Hemisphere. The USA and USSR managed to find other outlets, like the space race, to express their rivalry. Reunified Germany eschewed military might. It's not impossible to imagine a future in which the China-US rivalry gets added to this really small list. A future in which trade wars and cutthroat competition never cross the line into real war and actual throat-cutting. On the other hand, it's even easier to imagine a future where everything goes kaboom. Dig into the 12 examples when great power rivalry turned into full-blown conflict, and there's, as the national interest put it, an overabundance of cases where, to quote, "the proximate causes of war included accidents, unforced errors, and unintended consequences of unavoidable choices in which one of the protagonists accepted increased risks of hoping that another would back down." In other words, wars blew up, not because one side was like, "Woo, let's shoot some people," but because random events led them down an escalatory path with one inevitable outcome. Famously, this includes World War I, where the chance assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir by a 19-year-old in Bosnia plunged Europe's powers into an entirely avoidable meat grinder. But it also includes stuff like the Franco-Prussian War, which was sparked by, of all things, a telegram describing a rude diplomatic encounter in Eames. Or the Russia-Japanese War, which only ignited after the Russians blithely crossed one too many Japanese red lines without ever really believing that Tokyo was serious about enforcing them. And it is here that we get to the reason for this video's existence. The reason you're probably watching it right now. While it's entirely possible a Sino-American war will be sparked by a Chinese armada bearing down on Taiwan, it's also possible the trigger won't be anything so clear-cut, that both sides will simply miscalculate over a flashpoint and accidentally set the doomsday machine in motion. It's these flashpoints that we want to analyze today. For those who believe Beijing is gunning for military confrontation with America, the 2020s represent a bit of a worrying time. The tail end of this decade will see the US retire a large chunk of its naval force, including submarines, ships, and planes. While this will give way to a much improved Asia-Pacific presence in the 2030s, it means there's a narrow window of time in which China will potentially have the upper hand. Add to that Xi Jinping's widely reported order for his military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, and you can see why the next few years might give Pentagon planners the sweats. The fear is that Beijing will decide it has a critical window of time to attack the island democracy while America is weaker than normal. That ticking clock could lead Xi Jinping to gamble on a dangerous course of action, one which might involve a devastating surprise attack on US forces in the Pacific to keep them from coming to Taiwan's aid, a modern-day Pearl Harbor. For many, this scenario is as close to the platonic ideal of a US-China conflagration as you can get, the nightmare that keeps army brass awake at night. Yet there are reasons to think it's not the most likely way things could blow up around Taiwan. For one thing, there's the cost calculation for China in launching a gun-ho attack on the island, one that could wind up gaining Xi Jinping little more than smoldering ruins. As Air and Space Forces magazine put it, China would prefer unification with Taiwan, which it views as a breakaway province, to be as bloodless as possible. A war could devastate the Taiwanese economy, especially in the vital semiconductor industry. For another thing, even an America bloodied by a surprise attack would still be a formidable foe, one that, as Xi Jinping definitely knows, would never let the deaths of American servicemen in Pacific bases go unpunished. All of which may be why the experts quoted in Air and Space Forces didn't rank a full-blown invasion as the likeliest spark around Taiwan. Instead, that honor went to an accident or a miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait. As everyone knows, China's official position on Taiwan is that it is a renegade province that's still officially and legally part of China. While this doesn't make much difference to people's daily lives, it does mean that Beijing therefore believes the 12 nautical miles around Taiwan are its sovereign territory. It also means that under Chinese law, there are no competing claims on the waters of the Taiwan Strait. Stretching for 160 kilometers between the mainland and the island of Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait is one of the most important shipping channels on Earth. If China recognized Taiwan as an independent nation, the two would have a competing claim over the waters, one that would likely be handled like the British and French claims to the English Channel. But because Beijing considers Taiwan its territory, it recognizes no claims other than its own. And that's a major problem because China guards its maritime exclusive economic zones with all the jealousy and subtlety of Cujo. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, vessels in EEZs have freedoms of navigation and overflight and other internationally lawful uses of the sea. But China denies this, which is why the US and its allies routinely sail warships through the strait to make a point about freedom of navigation. Unfortunately, this means American and Chinese vessels often get into close calls. In June 2023, for example, a Chinese warship nearly crashed into an American boat. These sorts of incidents are why experts fear a confrontation in the strait could one day lead to war following an accident or miscalculation. Nor are the risks just associated with the sea. Above the strait exists an invisible barrier known as the Davis Line, the midway point between China and Taiwan. Rather than just an arbitrary boundary, the line is meant to mark where the two nations' air defense identification zones meet. Chinese aircraft know they shouldn't cross to the Taiwanese side. Between 1954 and 2020, they did so only 4 times. Since then, though, Beijing has crossed the Davis Line hundreds of times. In 1 month in 2020 alone, Taiwan logged nearly 450 violations. Each time this happens, it raises the possibility of an incident, one that would initially blow up between China and Taiwan, but which could quickly drag in the US, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and perhaps the world. And if a Pacific-wide blowing up over sailing rights or airspace violations sounds kooky, well, so did the idea that nearly 20 million Europeans would die because some archduke got shot in Sarajevo. Still, the Taiwan Strait isn't the only nautical flashpoint between the US and its allies and China. There are dangers lurking to the south as well. In his magisterial book on the causes of the First World War, The Sleepwalkers, Christopher Clark spends some time dwelling not just on how unlikely war seemed, but how unthinkable its eventual shape was. For example, the British spent the early 1900s worrying that the next Great War wouldn't be sparked in the Balkans, but in their Indian colonies, and they didn't think they would be fighting Germany, but an imperialist Russia trying to expand south. We mention this to reinforce an important point. History rarely unfolds as we expect. While the greatest tensions between the US and China are around Taiwan, the island democracy and its waters aren't the only potential flashpoints. For all our collective focus on Taipei, a future conflict could potentially erupt elsewhere. Somewhere like the Philippines. If Beijing's claims over the Taiwan Strait are legally dubious but at least have an internal logic, then its claims on the South China Sea are simply dubious. For years now, Beijing has been claiming sovereignty over nearly the entire sea, a place of such value to global trade that it makes even the Taiwan Strait look middling and unimportant. This is a claim no one else agrees with. As the BBC has noted, an international court ruled in 2016 that the assertion has no legal basis. But that hasn't stopped Beijing from trying to boost its claim with reclamation projects, constructing artificial islands, or just swiping other nations' territory. One nation that has suffered in recent years is the Philippines. In 2012, China seized control of Scarborough Shoal, an uninhabited atoll claimed by Manila. Since then, Beijing has aggressively muscled in on the country's remoter reaches. Filipino fishermen are frequently driven away from their traditional grounds near the Spratly Islands. Last year, Manila was forced to file more than 200 diplomatic complaints against Chinese vessels. Just a few months ago, in February, a Chinese patrol even shone a military-grade laser at a Filipino Coast Guard boat to stop it from reaching an atoll. Clearly, Beijing is playing a dangerous game, but you might reasonably ask, well, what does this have to do with the US? And the answer to that is almost everything. Back in 2019, A Chinese plan to build a $2 billion smart city on the Philippine island of Fuga caused a scandal in Manila's security establishment. Although then-President Rodrigo Duterte tried to keep relations friendly with Beijing, the incident convinced the Trump administration to send a signal that China wasn't wanted in the region. Accordingly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reaffirmed the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, a treaty that commits the U.S. to come to Manila's aid if any of its armed forces, planes, or coastal patrol vessels are attacked. It's an affirmation that's only become more important since Bongbong Marcos took power. Elected president in 2022, Marcos has taken an increasingly hawkish approach to China. More naval patrols have been ordered of Manila's waters, and defense cooperation increased with the US, Australia, and Japan, including giving American aircraft access to 4 strategically important Philippine bases. In return, the US has once again reaffirmed the Mutual Defense Treaty. Not only that, but Washington is now talking about running joint Philippine-US patrols of contested waters, patrols possibly joined by American ally Australia. And you don't have to be a genius to see how this might go badly wrong. China already has a track record of menacing Philippine ships. If some gung-ho captain miscalculates, we might see something like the laser incident happening to American sailors, or perhaps something even worse. As the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft wrote, a Philippine-China clash over patrol ships and maritime claims, with the United States and perhaps Australia frontally present in the theater as an ally, could plausibly escalate to a great power conflict. Now, obviously, war with America is the last thing China wants, so you might assume that an American presence would stop Beijing from menacing Manila's ships. But the opposite may be the case. If China believes the Philippines to be a part of an American strategy of encirclement, it might increase the sense that Beijing is under siege and needs to lash out to protect its interests. In a big piece on the possibility of war with China, The Atlantic recently described Beijing's habit of using teachable moments, short, sharp bursts of violence, to make its enemies back off. One such moment might come in the form of a surprise attack on Filipino bases on hard-to-defend islands the PLA could quickly overrun. In that scenario, the US would either have to meekly turn a blind eye, or risk a Pacific conflagration over a handful of small, sparsely populated islands claimed by an ally. Not that Manila is America's only regional ally trying to stop China encroaching on its turf. There's also Japan. It's a treaty with an important clause, Article 5, which states that an attack on one of the allies is an attack on all. No, we're not talking about NATO's famous collective defense agreement. We're talking about the joint US-Japan security treaty, the one that compels Washington to come to Tokyo's aid if it's attacked. Keep that in mind as we go over this next bit, documenting recent Chinese aggression towards Japan. Because if that aggression ever turns to violence, Article 5 could force America into fighting its first Pacific War in decades, a war sparked by a clump of uninhabited rocks nearly 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo. Known as the Senkaku Islands in Japan, these tiny rocks near Taiwan are Tokyo's version of Manila's island problem. Claimed by Beijing under the name Diaoyu Islands, these outcrops have been the scene of intense Chinese naval activity in recent years. 2022 saw China's ships spending a record amount of time loitering nearby. This has caused anxiety in Japan's security establishment for 2 good reasons. One is that the Senkakuses help to protect Tokyo's vital trade routes. The second is that Beijing might use violence to secure them. Back in 2021, Beijing updated its laws to allow the Chinese Coast Guard to use force to protect national sovereignty. And when you put it like that, it seems reasonable. But then you remember that China already defines the Senkakus as part of its territory, which means Beijing would feel justified using weapons to drive Japan away. It's thanks to stuff like this that Tokyo now regards China as an immediate existential threat, one almost as dangerous to Japan as Russia is to Ukraine. Nor is that a blithe comparison, as foreign policy details the Russian attack on Ukraine seriously spooked the Japanese to quote, that a major power armed with nuclear weapons could invade a neighbor with impunity, seeking to unilaterally change borders by force, shook Japan to the core. The nuclear factor is key here. Tokyo watched, horrified, as the world hesitated about supporting Ukraine over the fear of nuclear escalation. Watched, too, Vladimir Putin's bellicose threats to use Russia's arsenal against its smaller neighbor. The parallels of nuclear-armed China encroaching on non-nuclear Japan's territory were painfully clear. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida even declared, "Ukraine is the future of Asia." More telling still might have been the National Security Strategy document released in December 2022, a document which labeled China the greatest strategic challenge ever to securing the peace and stability of Japan. It's a strategic challenge Tokyo is now desperately scrambling to respond to. Under new guidelines, Japan is moving to boost its defense spending to 2% of GDP by 2027, a change that would make it the third largest military spender in the world. As well as engaging in the largest buildup of its forces since World War II, Japan will use this money to turn many of its remote islands into hardened bases, porcupines studded with anti-ship missiles and air defenses. Importantly, some of those bases will also be armed with American Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of hitting mainland China, nor will Tokyo necessarily wait for Beijing to strike first. The new guidance also reinterprets the Constitution's self-defense clause to allow for a devastating preemptive strike if an attack is believed imminent. Now, we should stress that not all of this is driven by fears over China. North Korea is a real and present threat to Japan and has fired missiles over the country in recent years. At least some of these changes are a response to the danger from Pyongyang. But the biggest audience is clearly intended to be the Winnie the Pooh lookalikes out in Beijing. Same deal with Japan's growing system of alliances. As well as its security treaty with Washington, Tokyo has been putting new emphasis on its relationship with fellow Quad members, India and Australia. Likewise, there has been increased outreach to the Philippines and even Japan's historic enemy, South Korea. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has even worked to get European countries on side, traveling to Kiev to meet Zelensky and becoming one of the few Asian leaders to wholeheartedly join sanctions on Russia. Now, great as all of this is for Tokyo's defense, it comes with a serious downside. This web of alliances increases the chance of a local conflict expanding into a globe-spanning war. In their gloomy deep dive, The Atlantic noted how Beijing has been looking to pick a fight with Tokyo for decades, saying, quote, "For years, Chinese strategists have speculated about a short, sharp war that would humiliate Japan, rupture its alliance with Washington, and serve as an object lesson for other countries in the region." That might come in the form of an invasion of the Senkakus, or maybe in the form of lightning strikes on the new bases, especially if China believes there's a chance Japan might use them to attack first. Either way, a flare-up with Japan would again put the US in an invidious position. A position in which Washington either refuses to come to Japan's aid and looks weak and unable to protect its allies, or risks tens of thousands of Americans dying to help Tokyo retaliate. Make no mistake, it would be a horrific choice. While a full-scale invasion of Taiwan would probably see the American public rally behind military action, and doubly so if it opened with Chinese attacks on US Pacific bases, would they be willing to risk uncountable numbers killed to retake the Senkakus? On the other hand, could the US stomach looking weak and unreliable before its enemies? We don't have any answers. This is just one of the myriad ways that the doomsday machine might be set in motion, that the Thucydides Trap might spring shut and plunge Asia-Pacific into renewed great power conflict. Is it a trap that can be avoided? Well, the signs aren't looking good. Washington and Beijing are barely talking. In the military establishments of both nations, a kind of fatalism seems to be creeping in, a feeling that war is inevitable no matter how dreadful it might be. Perhaps the only question left is how will it start? And in this video, we've outlined a few possibilities, but the truth is that no one knows for sure, any more than Europeans knew at the start of 1914 that their world would be undone by a gunshot in Sarajevo. All we can try to do is be aware of the dangers and tread carefully, because the last thing we want, decades from now, is for some historian to blithely sum up our era with the simple words, "It was the rise of China and the fear that this instilled in America that made war inevitable."